The British soldiers wore the 1908 pattern webbing equipment all throughout the war, and it can be worn in different ways. This is what's known as marching order. The small haversack would be on the left hand side over the bayonet. Then they would have a large backpack. They would have the mess tin in there and all the other bits of equipment, and then the steel helmet would be fastened to it like that with those connecting straps. By 1918 there were 4.5 million men in the British Army, and of those 800,000 British soldiers were killed in the First World War. That doesn't include the Commonwealth troops. And one of those men who died was my grandmother's brother, my great uncle, and this is two pictures of him here. His name was Richard Edward Banks, and he was killed on the 30th of April 1918, aged 34. He was in the 17th Battalion, the King's Liverpool Regiment. If you look at the picture on the left, that was him in 1916 when he joined up. And then the picture on the right was taken on his last leave home about a month before he was killed. He looks a completely different man. If my grandma hadn't given me those two photographs, I wouldn't have believed it was the same person. But having done a bit of a history on him, we found out that in 1917 he was seriously wounded. If you look on his left sleeve, he's got a wound stripe there. He had scars to his face and concussion of the spine, so he'd probably been hit by an artillery shell or something, and he was back in England for over 6 months recovering before he went back. But just looking at the strain on his face, it just shows what those men went through in that time. My great uncle had a son, but the son never married, and when I first started collecting a long time ago, he gave me some of his father's possessions. These are what somebody had sent back after being killed. This is his mess tin. This is the mess tin he would have carried all throughout the war. You've got a little handle in there so you can eat your food, hot food with it. Also in there was the mess tin cover, the canvas mess tin cover. It can either be fastened to the belt or fastened to the backpack. And also in there was his cap badge. That's the original badge that you can see in those photographs I showed you earlier. And there's one of his shoulder titles. He was in the King's Liverpool Regiment. Then we have his identity tags. Those are there. They're made of compressed fibre, so when soldiers were buried with those, when they dig them up in the, in later on in life, those have always rotted away. So it's always very difficult to find out who British soldiers were when they find remains. Then there was this. This is the ammunition pouch for a pistol. And at first I could never understand why that was in there, but later on I did some research into his history, and I found out that about 2 months before he was killed he was trained to be a Lewis gunner, so that's why I had that. Lewis machine gunners and non-commissioned officers would have pistols. Then also there was a notebook that came to light as well. This is the notebook he carried, and there's bits of information there, some of that is how much money he was paid and everything. And that mark there, there's a hole there, that's where the bullet went through that killed him. It went through all the paperwork like that and came out the other side of the thing. So they are now in my possession. Because the Germans were the first one to set up defensive positions, they had the advantage of the high ground, and in Belgium, where most of the British Army were, the land there was pretty low and flat anyway, so the high ground was a real benefit. So that left all the low-lying areas for the British trenches, and that they were plagued by being flooded, and that would cause the men to be stood in water and mud for days on end. That would lead to trench foot, which is a big problem with the army. And mud was it was a massive problem around on the British trenches, and they even had breech covers on the rifles to stop the mud getting into the works of the gun. This soldier is kitted out for attacking an enemy trench. He's wearing the 1908 pattern cotton webbing equipment, and tucked into his belt is a barbed wire cutter, an essential piece of kit on the Western Front. As I mentioned before, there was different ways of wearing the away webbing equipment. This is what's known as fighting order. The entrenching tool in its case would be moved from the right hand side over the water canteen round to the back, and then the large backpack that would be left behind in the trenches, and the small haversack that was on the left hand side over the bayonet would be put on the back, and then attached to that would be the D-shaped mess tin in a canvas cover. The cover was to stop the mess tin rattling about as they were marching along, and then quite often 1 or 2 men in a company would carry a spade ready for digging in entrenchments when they got to the destination. Following the example of the French, the British Army also started looking for a steel helmet, and a chap called John Leopold Brodie came up with this idea. It was really simple. It just stamped out of one piece of steel. It's like the French. It wasn't intended to stop a bullet. It was to help protect the wearer from shell fragments and shrapnel falling into the trench. Very simple design with a rim around the side. This is one of the earlier models. It's what's known as a raw edge. It's just stamped out of one piece of metal. Later on during the war, they would put some extra metal trim around the rim of the helmet to give it more strength. After the first cold winter of 1914, the British Army brought out some specialist clothing for the soldiers. This one was a special cap with ear flaps, and it was known by the soldiers as the Coal Blimey cap because of the appearance when they put it on. This is not a real one, this is just a replica. My great uncle is buried in a cemetery on the outskirts of a small village called Vermezelle, which is 3 miles south of the city of Ypres. Ypres became quite a strategic place for the British Army. It was in a salient that stuck out from the main trench line into the German territory. The Germans did occupy it right at the beginning of the war, but only for a few weeks. They were soon pushed out, and the British held it all throughout the war. But because it was one of the main bases for the British Army, I would think most British and Commonwealth soldiers who served on the Western Front would have passed through there at some time or other. But it was shelled and bombed for 4 years, and this photograph was taken in 1918, right at the end of the war. That remains of that tower in the middle of the photograph. That's from the Cloth Hall in the city centre, and the remains of the building on the far left, that's the remainder of the cathedral. And after the First World War, when it was all over, the Belgians decided that we were going to rebuild Ypres to be exactly as it was before the war started. And this is the centre of Ypres today. I took this photograph about 2 years ago when we were out there visiting some of the battlefield sites. The tower on the left hand side, that's the Cloth Hall, and then the spire in the middle is the cathedral. It's the most beautiful place. It's unbelievable. You just can't imagine what it once looked like. And because of the First World War, there's a strong bond between Belgium and England. At the start of the war, thousands of Belgian refugees came over to England for safety while the war was going on. And if you go to London and go along the Thames embankment, you'll find a large statue and a memorial. It was donated by the people of Belgium in thanks to the people of England for taking them in during the war. And also, if you ever go to the Isle of Anglesey, in North Wales, underneath the Menai Bridge, there's a paved walkway just along the coast, and it's called the Belgian Promenade. And that was built during the First World War by the Belgian refugees who were staying on the island, in thanks to all the locals for putting them up and making them feel welcome. And at the present day, there's quite a strong bond forming now between us and the people from Ukraine. All these Ukrainian refugees are coming over here for safety. They're the same. They're very grateful for what we're doing. But I just wonder, these other tens of thousands of refugees and asylum seekers who come over, whether they will ever show any gratitude like these others have done. I won't hold your breath about that one. And also in Ypres, after the war, one of the entrances to the city, they built a large stone arch. It's called the Menin Gate, and on the walls inside are inscribed the names of 50,000 British and Commonwealth troops who have no known grave. They're the ones who were just killed around that area, not just in the whole of the war, just in that area. And in thanks as well by the Belgians, every night at 8 o'clock, and I think it's since 1928, 4 members of the local fire brigade come out with bugles and play the last post. Some nights there might only be 1 or 2 people there, but sometimes there's hundreds. That night we were there were hundreds of people there. And it's been going on non-stop ever since, and it's still going on today.